What up, Pittsburgh Steelers fans? Matty P here with another episode of Steelers Touch and Under. We're talking, does it really make sense for the Steelers to trade for Justin Fields? So there's been a lot of hype around the Steelers trading for Justin Fields, improving supposedly on Kenny Pickett. A lot of this doesn't factor into whether they sign or re-sign Mason Rudolph. There's been a lot of talk around Ryan Tannehill. I know that the video on our channel around Ryan Tannehill, which if you haven't seen so far, you can go back and have a look at that. I'll try and link it into this video. It's been getting a lot of hits in the last 24, 48 hours. The hype is building around Justin Fields. I was really hoping I wouldn't have to really talk about this topic because I don't necessarily agree with it. And also, I didn't think that I'd be talking about it so soon. But such is the hype in the NFL. We're barely days out from the Super Bowl and close of the season. The Steelers are already cutting plays and making moves, so the Steelers are definitely feeding into that hype. We are already getting hyped really, really keenly, as we are on this channel anyway, about what the Steelers are going to do to improve for 2024 and how they can finally get over their playoff win hurdle. So I thought we'd do something a bit different. You've probably seen, if you're interested in this topic, or even if you're not, you all heard it by almost osmosis at this point in time, about the Steelers and Justin Fields and would he be better, would he not, what do you trade for him, what do you not, all these different things. I'm going to address it from why it actually is unlikely because of the rest of the league, and then we can do a quick comparison to Kenny Pickett, Mason Rudolph. Are the Steelers really upgrading, or are they just wasting a second-round pick? Because I will say this before we get into the trade element. Remember, a lot of people talking about a second-round pick. It's definitely not worth the first. If you give up a second-round pick, remember the players the Steelers have drafted in the last 3 drafts in the second round. George Pickens, Pat Freiermuth, Keanu Benton, and Joe Porter Jr. 4 quality starters on offense and defense, 2 on each side of the football. So I always said 2 sides of offense and defense. I know there's three sides in the NFL, the special teams, of course. So that's one thing to keep in mind with what I'm about to share with you. All right. If we look at an actual draft order for the NFL draft this year, if you look at the second round right now, forget the first round, but it's important that I show you the first round as well. It's important to have a look at the third round because of the different picks that some of the teams I'm going to talk about have. On Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks' Move the Sticks podcast a couple of episodes ago, they talked about why it would make more sense for New England, to trade for Justin Fields. Because if they traded their 34th pick, essentially almost a first rounder, 2 picks outside of that, the only real difference is that you don't get the 5th-year option, but there's definitely going to be all the top, there'll be top guys in the mix available at 34. They talked about then New England could then take a king's ransom to build around Fields, see if they get by for a few years, and if it doesn't work with the new coach and new GM, then they can move forward and re-pick a quarterback, right? So that's New England. But there are actually a number of different teams in this similar position. You've actually got the Giants, Washington, you have Atlanta, Vegas, and Tennessee. Now, the thing about all of those teams is that they are all drafting, apart from Minnesota, in the top 10. And Minnesota's sitting out there at 11. So the argument for and against for each of these teams is also the argument for is also the argument against for each of these teams. Now, if I look at it, to be honest, I don't think that I think teams like Atlanta and teams like Tennessee will be hoping let's start with Washington. That makes better sense. Washington will have access to a top draft pick. So unless they really don't want to use that, which with a new coach and a new GM, they're gonna do that, right? Particularly if Caleb Williams starts falling, he's not the top guy, right? Then in Chicago, I heard a rumor that they are really liking him. But I know that Caleb Williams has a relationship with the Washington area. I think he comes from the area. He has a relationship with the coaching staff as well. So, it's hard-pressed to think that Washington is not drafting a quarterback, right? And obviously, if we're talking about trading Fields, Chicago is drafting a quarterback. So those 2 teams, I'm going to put them out because I don't see Washington not doing it. The first team on the board is New England. But the Giants are in an interesting spot because the Giants have a situation where Daniel Jones is getting paid a lot of money. They're not really for it. They played Tommy DeVito last year. But the Giants have 2 second-round picks, and they have a pretty high third-round pick at pick 70, right? So essentially, when you look at the Giants, they're suddenly really – I want to make sure they didn't have a third second-round pick. But they're essentially in the mix here, right? And I actually think it can make a lot of sense because – I think Justin Fields can transition to that offense, a bit better. Were they going to get more reliable play, though, than what they get from Daniel Jones, which is a big question and a big challenge for a lot of Giants fans out there? That's a whole different story. So whether the Giants make sense or not, we'll see. Tennessee with a new coaching staff. Now, that is a really interesting situation because they have pick number 38 in the draft. Again, a guy could fall because Arizona and the Chargers are both going to have, they already got their quarterbacks on the roster. Unless they're going to pull off a blockbuster trade for Kyler Murray, then, and where's he going to go? And they're going to need all of that. They're not moving from Kyler Murray this year. So there's two teams blocked. If the New England Patriots draft that quarterback as well, there's still like a couple of guys in the mix because you're probably looking at Caleb Williams, Drake May in there, and then Jaden Daniels. There's still a few other quarterbacks around as well that could be drafted. So, and who knows what's going to happen after combine and pro days and all of those things. So then you get into Atlanta and Minnesota. Now, Atlanta picks at 43, Minnesota picks at 42. I kind of think Minnesota and the Giants are the two names that speak out to me if Atlanta don't want to go that way. The reason why I think Atlanta would be interesting if they go there is they just moved on for Arthur Smith. They have Desmond Ridder in there. What's the gap between Desmond Ridder and Justin Fields? Like, that's the bit that I'm kind of like, well, what are you really changing? Because you could try and develop Desmond Ridder for an extra year and then see how that goes before you're throwing all this weight and all this draft capital into getting Justin Fields. The other thing, too, is if you have a quarterback fall to you, right, in the draft at picking at number 8 again, then your situation is that you want to back that guy up with a good O-line or pair him with a wide receiver or all those sorts of things. So I don't really understand from a trading and draft perspective for Atlanta, are they really getting their money's worth? I don't think so, right? Particularly if the Giants or Tennessee make a move out of this, then and they've already done this, then there's obviously going to be a quarterback fall to Atlanta. That's the challenging thing. As I say, Minnesota could be interesting because they could sit there and say, we trade now with 42. Talent or the top round talent we're going to get at 42, a little bit questionable. We need a quarterback. We need it cheap. And it's assuming, of course, they're not bringing back Kirk Cousins. And then they can go pick someone at number 11. They've got pretty good wide receivers. But if like Brock Bowers was available then, there's a top tackle that they could pair with Christian Darrisaw, you go get another corner, which I know they've drafted a corner in recent years. They basically can get their choice of anyone. They could even trade back. There's less of an onus of them to sit in that position, right? Particularly if they weren't going to sign Kirk Cousins, I thought JJ McCarthy could be the name on their lips kind of thing to draft, or the name on the card when they run it up. So Minnesota's quite interesting, right? And then the other team I will say is Vegas. So they're at 13. They're pretty much out of the quarterback hunt. They pick at 44. So with all their new regime there, they've just had the Super Bowl there. They could really sit there and say, hey, we want to make a splash now. We want to get people involved. We want to, reinvigorate the fan base, do all those things. That could be the big move that Vegas goes and makes. So to me, as I say, I think it's Vegas, possibly Minnesota, the Giants, and Tennessee. I think they're the four. I think actually they're the four teams. If New England thought highly enough of Justin Fields to trade the second pick in the second round to go get him. So you've kind of got four teams that I think are in the mix. I've basically taken you through 6 teams that it's a possibility with, and they're all drafting in the top 13 picks. So that's kind of the interesting part. So before we even get to the Steelers element, who will pick at 20 and 51, there's other teams that are up there. And I actually don't think it is worth it for the Steelers to trade the 51st pick either. That's just my perspective. I think you trade a third this year if you thought Fields was it, and went against all the opinion of the rest of the league. And I think he traded like a third next year or a fourth next year. Like I do not think the top 2 picks in this draft need to fix the line. My theme all offseason has been fix the line since the last few games of the season, but definitely coming out in my reaction video to the loss against the Bills, I said, you've got to fix the O-line, right? So that's the drafting side of things. If you look at the actual play side of things, and I will just share this, I know everyone's out on PFF numbers. If you actually look at PFF passing numbers, though, if you do look at PFF passing numbers, Kenny Pickett has a 68.8 passing grade, right? Justin Fields, 67.1. Now, Kenny Pickett has an overall offensive grade of 70.6. Justin Fields has a 74.6 because Justin Fields has an 84.9 rushing grade, which we all know he does, but that comes at the cost of a 33.7 fumble grade versus a Kenny Pickett 91.3. So you look at that alone, Mason Rudolph sits there with a 64 offensive grade, 64.8 passing grade. But obviously PFF marked him down in terms of games and stuff like that. And when he came in at the end of that Colts game, it wasn't great. His fumble grade's high because of the wet and the Ravens game, and his rushing grade is lower than them both, right? So Kenny Pickett still wins on this. If we look at the stats that I've got on the screen, I've got these three blokes in front of you. Originally, I was just going to compare Justin Fields to Kenny Pickett because I think Kenny Pickett's the slot at the start there. I think he deserves another chance. If it doesn't work this season or if he's injured for a lot of it, then that's it. Your best ability is your availability. You didn't do it, right? If you look at these stats alone, if you compare the stats I'm about to compare for you and below with Justin Fields to Kenny Pickett comes out on top in almost every statistical area. You look at Mason Rudolph, and things start to balance out a little bit, but Kenny Pickett's actually the clear winner, and we'll go through it, and here's why. Now, the first thing to remember is that when you look at these three blokes, one's played 40 games, one's played half that basically in Mason Rudolph, and Kenny Pickett's not played much more, right? So obviously there's going to be a green tick for Justin Fields. AV is going to be a green tick as well because of the way he's played in those games, because of what he does as a rusher. Now, I'm not disputing Justin Fields is more of a, I'm not going to call complete package, but he's more of a mobile running quarterback than either of these two blokes. Certainly, of course, more than Mason Rudolph. However, the Steelers don't need that. The Steelers have Najee Harris. The Steelers have Jaylen Warren. The Steelers, I think, should go out in the late rounds and try to look for a guy that slipped in the draft. Or that is a vet that's cut that gives them something different, right? Like, so quite honestly, like the cost benefit for that to me, like plus losing draft capital and having to make a trade is huge. If you trade Deontay Johnson for him, which is never going to happen, then maybe, right? But he still needs someone to throw to. So, and I don't know if you can have the enigmas of Justin Fields and George Pickens, but that's probably enough. That's probably enough for a whole different show altogether. But if you actually look at the QB record, Mason Rudolph is ahead here. If you compare it just Justin Fields with Kenny Pickett is ahead. You look at completion percentage, both Mason Rudolph and Kenny Pickett are higher than Justin Fields. You look at pass yards. Of course, Justin Fields has more because he's played in more games. But in playing 15 more games, he has about 2,200 more than Kenny Pickett. If you look at pass attempts, he does lead with 7 yards per pass attempt. I should say he does lead with 7, right? He does. 6.7 Mason Rudolph, 6.3 Kenny Pickett. If you actually look at yards per game played, though, despite all the criticism of Kenny Pickett is the highest here, right? Absolute highest here. Now, Mason's numbers are lessened by what he had to deal with in 2019. Of course, when you look at the stretch that he had recently, he played a lot better than that. Of course, past TDs, it's much higher than with Justin Fields, but the interception rate is higher as well. Now, if you actually look at it per game, I think Kenny Pickett has the lowest interception rate. We'll look at that below. Mason Rudolph's pretty close to him, though. Justin Fields has 30. Justin Fields also has a number of fumbles. Justin Fields has 68 turnovers in 40 games. But just keep that in mind. When you look at rush, obviously, as I said, it changes things here. But it's kind of interesting in terms of, like, for all the rushing that Justin Fields has and for playing all the games he's played in next year, he only has 10 more rushing touchdowns than Kenny Pickett. So, you know, he's asked to do it all over there, of course. You look at quarterback rating, Mason Rudolph is the highest over the course of the career. Kenny Pickett's not too far away from Justin Fields, but Kenny Pickett, I also think, played in a worsely schemed offense. That's my opinion on it. If you look at actual interception percentage, Kenny Pickett 1.8%, Justin Fields 3.1%. And this is one of the most important stats that if you take away anything from this video, even though it's like 12, 13, 14 minutes in the video, this is one. Because for this stat, this is how the Steelers win football games that people go, oh, they shouldn't win that. Or this is how they win in the cold. This is how they win on short turnarounds. This is how they win in Pittsburgh at night. It's low margin football. And if you're going to throw interceptions, you are not playing low margin football. Now, in fairness, absolute fairness to Justin Fields, his TD percentage is a lot higher, with 4.2% of his offensive plays resulting in a TD in the passing game versus 1.8% for Kenny Pickett. But remember, we're not counting like the Kenny Pickett sneaks or any of those things. Obviously, we're not counting Justin Fields' rushing TDs. Mason Rudolph's is pretty high, though. And Mason Rudolph is one of the things that when you talk about the trading for Justin Fields is you've got to factor in is Mason coming back. And we've heard some different narratives around that in the last week. Also around, does he want a fresh start? But Mason stacks up pretty well. But Mason and Kenny Pickett versus Justin Fields, that QB room stacks up pretty well as well. It's a lot cheaper too. In terms of the other parts around accuracy, I thought this was kind of interesting. If you look at on-target throws, I expected Kenny Pickett to be a little bit better in his raw number. I didn't expect him to be in first place because of the number of games he's played. It is interesting Mason Rudolph is ahead of them both, but it's pretty close. But it is kind of worth mentioning from that scenario as well. You look at bad throw percentage too, like Kenny Pickett, Mason Rudolph, it's much lower. Sorry, the actual raw number of bad throws, you look at it as a percentage-wise, Justin Fields is higher than them both. But again, not too much variance there. But then why would you give up a second-round pick if you're not going to get a huge amount of improvement in that area? That's the other thing as well. So when I look at this overall, do I seriously sit here and say it is worth trading for Justin Fields, giving up a draft pick in this year's draft? If you gave one in a future draft like next year and you got away with that and gave a second, fine, maybe, but you better have faith in the Artie Smith offense, because that's the other wrinkle to this draft. Like, not only you've got to be careful of the variables in the NFL. You're changing OC, you're changing a bunch of OC coaches. That is necessary, not disputing that. You've got questions on Kenny Pickett because of how injured he's been over the last few years. You've got questions on how slow his development's been. But you've got to work out, is that him? And part of it is him, because he has regret. There were areas he regressed. I think there are a couple of other areas he improved in some ways. But there's also the element that he was playing in a bad offense. Do the Steelers really have time, with Minka and Cam getting older and TJ Watt as well, to simply be spending more time trying to evaluate the quarterback and work through another variable? No, the Steelers need solutions faster. And as I showed you, the discussion around trading for Justin Fields almost doesn't make sense when you've got 6 other teams that could do this tomorrow and have more of a reason to do it than the Pittsburgh Steelers. And honestly, then the debate's all finished anyway. So I'd love to know in the comments, you for Justin Fields, are you not been training for Justin Fields? Do you not even care? Do you think this debate is absolutely too much hysteria and hype? Or do you think the Steelers should just simply go with what they've got, provided Mason comes back? Or do they need to trade up in the draft with one of these teams after one of the teams I've mentioned, trades the second round pick for Justin Fields? Should the Steelers move up 9, 10, 11, 12 spots to try and get a quarterback? You let me know in the comments. As always, go Steelers.